Peace and love, everyone. I'm here with Davidya Buckland. He is the author of Our Natural Potential, someone that I highly admire and appreciate. And we're going to chat today about various topics, stages of enlightenment, healing, what that looks like in the context of daily life. So I thank you for taking the time to speak with me again, David.
Oh, namaste. I'm
Namaste.
more than happy to chat.
Yeah. So perhaps we'll just start with a moment of silence and just allowing the radiance and the brilliance of this presence to really come to the foreground. Sort of set the stage for our discussion. Yeah. All right. So perhaps you can start off by sharing a little bit about the layers of divinity. I know this is something that you've been working on as a current project, and I'd love to hear some more about it.
Sure. I think the most important first point to make about this, though, is that what we're talking about is something that can be directly experienced. We're not talking about belief or about concepts. I mean, there's some concepts in there. If you're going to use words, there has to be concepts behind them to have meaning and so on.
Yeah.
But this isn't about sort of a prescription of understanding that's required. I mean, it's good to have some background behind it, but we're talking mainly about direct experience, levels of reality that we can come to know. And so we're talking about the progression of how that can unfold. And the importance, and that's where the importance of spiritual techniques comes in this context, is to help connect with Source, give us that inner connection with our universality, to heal, resolve what is unresolved for us, emotionally, mentally, or however that shows up for us, and then to refine perception. And what that means is the culturing of the layers between that inner source and the surface, so that they become more conscious and not so much in shadow, so that they can be directly experienced and they're become part of our routine life. So yeah, layers of divinity. Yeah, essentially, the world around us. There's a context. We could say that it's all divinity from one level, and so you have a pure abstraction, where there's dynamics that become conscious and interplay and giving rise to creation, the universe, and what we perceive around us in these various layers. Big simplification. Now, and there's also another context in which there's free will, and in that context, humans have the ability to make choices, and we can choose to go with where life is pointing us, or we can decide to go against that, or tune it a little bit, or adjust it. And there's layers closer to the surface where laws of action and other kind of natural laws are in play, and they're always seeking balance. So when we act in a way that's against wholeness and growth, then there's some kind of correction required to bring it back again. And so on that level, there are these natural laws which we could say are divinely inspired, but they're the laws of the functioning of that arena. And if we're identified with our body mind as who we are, then we're going to be swept around by that. And if we're not aware of our deeper nature and having that connection with the divine, then there's the tendency to make poorer choices and not have the context to make those good choices, not have the big picture. And so by the spiritual practice, as I mentioned, by connecting to our source within and culturing that in our awareness, then we come to gain a greater context. And then in time, that inner universal awareness can wake up to itself through us. And that's broadly known as spiritual awakening or self-realization or cosmic consciousness. And the self wakes up to itself through us. So, and that's an important distinction in there too. It's not that the me, David doesn't wake up and become enlightened. We wake up from the person, and there are some renunciate-oriented teachings that suggest that it's the death of the me and the end of it. And there are certain aspects that do end, but it's more around the identification with the person, the body, our functionality that ends. There's still a person. You still need a person to function in the world. It's just not the center anymore. It's kind of, I sometimes use the analogy of it's like your thumb. It's a piece of the functionality you need to function, but it's not the center anymore. Yes. Whereas before that shift, it's the center. And what that platform does of that first shift of self-realization is it gives you that stable inner, absolute, unchanging peace, inner reality, and a stable platform and that larger context I mentioned earlier. And so it gives you a platform on which refined perception can develop much more. Now, some people do have refined perception prior to awakening.
Yes.
And that, but when the mind is still attached to its experiences, then it tends to be pulled back and forth and around, and then the refined perception gets pulled back and forth and around with us, and it can be. Some people experience it actually as a burden or a problem.
Yes, so the refined perception in that case is being filtered through that identified ego.
Yes, exactly. And so that there's a desire to control it in some way, or to keep it in some way, and those kinds of things as well. And again, the interpretation and. It's like it's my perception, and I am doing this, and those kind of.
Yeah, the sense of specialness can arise in reference to that as well.
Yes. There's a lot of challenges with that. But in the post-awakening, there still is quite commonly a fair bit of unpacking that takes place after that before it's fully established. There's the shift itself, which just takes a moment, but then there's a whole series of unpacking, because you're now this kind of infinite space.
Yes.
So all that stuff that's unresolved has an opportunity to rush forward and be seen.
Yes. So that identification with the person was holding down a lot of material.
Yeah.
And then when that identification is transcended, it's not that there's no longer the capacity to function, as you were saying, and the persona, that interface that allows for human experience to unfold. There's still the sense of being, that unique expression on a certain level, but it's not your fundamental nature.
Right.
It's not
what. If you stub your toe, you're still going to go ouch, and it's not the bookcase over there is going to go ouch. It's still, there's still that functionality there. It's just in a much larger context then.
Yes.
And so when you have that platform, then, as I mentioned, the refinement can develop a lot more. It tends to, in the West, we have a culture that really emphasizes the mind and intellect, the
Hmm.
approach of science, and that is actually quite good for certain kinds of things. It does, it can help in that fine discrimination in terms of the progress of consciousness, and it does help support that process. So in the West, you tend to see less of the refinement and more of the, you get a drier, flatter kind of self-realization, and then perhaps a unity shift later on where consciousness is recognized not just in here looking out, but being behind the world itself. It's like the world is a screen, movie screen, and playing out on a movie screen, and then you recognize that you're the screen as well. So it's
Yeah.
kind of you're both sides of the seeing dynamic, uh, and so there can be quite a bit of progress in consciousness. It tends to be easier with some of the techniques as well. Tend to culture that, but other techniques help with the refinement side more, and that allows this other process. It's kind of like this kind of like a masculine and feminine aspects. So
Hmm.
you have consciousness is like the masculine or Shiva side, the detached observer um, dynamic in consciousness, whereas the feminine is the expression, the objects of the world, and it's also in the process of experience between that subject and object. And the
Hmm.
process of experience is the really interesting part. It's the most subtle, but it's what's actually doing the doing. One of the features of self-realization is when we detach from our ego sense, and the ego's claims of that I did this and this is mine and so on. Then there's this sense of non-doing
Mm.
actions. The person still continues to act and do things as usual in its life, but we no longer experience ourselves as being the doer. It's just being done. Kind of like the way our heartbeat and our breath works normally, it just kind of happens. And we've kind of realized that actually that's what's been happening all along with most other stuff as well. It's just that the ego is claiming it is, but I did that, and this is mine, and so on.
Yes.
But now we're seeing that actually, no, it's just part of the play of nature in many ways. And so what can happen then is we can stop and look and think, so if I'm not doing the doing, what is doing the doing? And that can help lead into the refinement and the exploration of the mechanics of the world and what's happening around us.
Yeah. So maybe just to drop this into something that can, even this conversation right now is a manifestation of this level of intelligence. It's a flow of intelligent experiencing, within conscious awareness. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it's I find that I'm much better able to talk about this stuff if I just get out of the way. If the
Hmm.
person tries to organize it and lay it out, then yeah, I don't do as well.
Yes. Yes.
it,
Yeah.
it yeah, it's kind of they call it flow, just stepping into the flow where
Yeah.
you get out of the me and just allow what's wants to be said to speak,
Yes.
and I kind of can sit back and be surprised at what happens comes out of the mouth sometimes. It didn't
Yeah.
even, so the person didn't even necessarily know that, or whatever. Just kind of comes up.
Beautiful.
And people talk about it as consciousness speaking, and we're not talking about channeling or anything like that. By the way,
No, no,
it's not.
no.
This is coming from a much deeper place. So it's where it's because we become in that first shift, we become that universal self, and that opens the door for that to act through you and speak through you, and as you let go of the more and more of that sense of person and doership.
Mm.
So there's the refinement. There's kind of like two aspects of that really help with refinement. One of them is known as sattva, which is a quality, and the other one is kind of more of a quantity and a thing, soma. Now, sattva is one of what's known as the three gunas. Sattva refers to purity or clarity. Most commonly, you hear people talking about sattvas in terms of sattvic food, for example, that oranges are sattvic food or something like that. But I mean, that has its value on that level. Having a relatively clean, healthy body is useful. Um, but obsessing over your diet and so on like that for spiritual progress doesn't really help a lot, because that's not on the level in which awakening happens. Uh, the refinement we want to be refining is bringing sattva into those middle layers, and that involves healing the unhealed emotional baggage, and and uh, and resolving some of some of the stories and the concepts we have in the mind that and just being able to trust nature. And the subtler levels are primarily sattvic, but as you get
Mhm.
forward, because the opposite of sattva is known as tamas, which essentially means inertia, and you need some value of inertia for there to be form,
Mm.
as we know from physics. Um, so again, it's a question of balance, and we've been in a time where tamas or inertia became more dominant, and so consciousness was more clouded. And now sattva is rising, so there's more clarity in that. And again, some spiritual practices can help culture that inner clarity. And we're not just talking about clarity, like again, in the body or whatever, or in consciousness, but all those layers in between, because we can be quite clear on one level, and like people can have very clear uh, understanding of consciousness itself,
Mhm.
clear understanding of consciousness becoming, and yet be completely blocked up in their heart.
Yes.
So there isn't going to be a lot of refined emotions and the flow of love and so on like that if the
Mm.
heart is encrusted.
So when we speak about the feminine aspect in the context of refinement, as you're mentioning, this healing, attentive allowing of whatever's surfacing on the level of unresolved material is vital.
Yes,
Would you
vital.
agree? Yeah.
Right. Because most of us carry, we basically, the way we adapted to being human in the current time was to protect the heart by
Mm.
building essentially a black cross around it, and to defend it from um, energy. And because most of this is unconscious, it's just the way we habitually responded, and the energetic modeling we got from those around us who had done the same thing. So it's kind
Mhm.
of we passed on. So instead of learning ways to heal and release our emotions, we mostly learned how to suppress them and protect ourselves, defend. So there's kind of a process of shifting our energetic habits and the way we approach things. Um, I remember taking a workshop at one point, and they demonstrated the difference between and how when someone approaches us in an agitated state, how we respond to that, how much a difference it makes to both us and them, and the dynamic between that.
Mm.
If you're in defense when someone approaches you who's upset or angry or whatever, um, then it reflects the energy back and amplifies it, and so it tends to cause it tends to cause them to become more angry rather than being resolved, and do more dumping and so on, and then we get more defensive and so on. Whereas if we can learn to be okay and transparent, then that energy just passes right through us energetically,
Mm.
dissipates, and it takes the wind out of the sails of the person who's upset, and it just and it's oh, and it's over. And it's really fascinating to when we kind of did these exercises to practice this, and it was surprising how effective it was. And
Beautiful.
just that those little simple things like that. There's just and when you can experience it, then you can recognize uh, you've had the experience, and then you can start to learn to bring that habit up. And of course, we'll have places where we're more sensitive and reactive, and places where we're less so, and so we can be more open and start to culture that in those areas.
Sure. And oftentimes in these situations where we do see that level of reactivity arising, or perhaps there is something appearing to surface in the experience where we're being called out, or a soft spot, a tender spot is being um, poked. I feel that we're showing ourself. The self is showing itself something. There's something always to be learned in that context.
Yes.
So perhaps there is something that was present that we were not aware of. There was a blind spot or something that just hadn't been seen fully. Mm.
Yeah.
Through the intelligence within the field of experiencing, that can be brought up to the surface so that it can be seen. That doesn't mean that we have to fully act it out or become it or anything like that, but just for it to arise on
Yeah.
a subtle level and to be with it in that way.
Right. Yeah. It isn't about acting out our dramas, because that just can reinforce them.
Hmm.
It's about just being conscious of them and allowing them to be there.
Yes.
Because so much of that inner baggage is just simply experiences that have not completed.
Yes.
There's some value that, there was a traumatic experience or a difficult experience of some kind. We dealt with part of it, but we weren't comfortable with all of it at that moment, and then we didn't come back to it because we didn't understand how to do
Mm.
that kind of work. And so we've been carrying it with us all this time, and um, that kind of creates this, backlog. And even though we tend to suppress that and keep it hidden, it still leaks out, and it kind of acts like a filter on our experience and how we interpret the world, and it tends to leak out in different ways, and we can see it by what we're triggered by in our daily experience. And if we
Hmm.
learn instead to not be so reactive, but instead look to, okay, why am I being triggered? What's behind that? What's the charge that's there? And then we learn to feel that, and we can have these moments where there's just it's a brief intense emotion washes over us,
Hmm.
and then that experience is complete and it's done. And of course, there's some bigger stuff that takes a little bit more work, but a lot of it is just these little just bits and pieces of unresolved experiences, and then some of them can be from our early childhood, where at the time we didn't know how to deal with that stuff, but now as adults, it wouldn't be a problem. But it's kind of the boogeyman under the bed thing. So we're kind of
Yeah.
afraid of it because we were when we were young, and but now as adults, it's actually quite a bit. We're more afraid of the fear than fear itself, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
The result fear itself. Yeah, it's a process though. It takes time, and we have to learn some patience with ourselves and acceptance, where we tend to be so hard on ourselves. Uh,
Yeah. So irrespective of the stage, irrespective of our recognition of reality, it's not a matter of stuff not coming up, but how we are with the stuff that will inevitably come up on some level.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, beautiful. Yeah, and it's just we've been at it for a long time and lifetimes, depending on how you want to look at it. So it can take some time to work this stuff through. And it's interesting too, because some people that quite a few people who are on a spiritual path um, came into this life basically choosing to carry a significant load because they wanted to kind of make as much progress as possible.
Hmm.
And so, some of us have lots of work to be done, but we also have the potential to have the support for that to be handled and to work through that. Um, I mean, some of the stuff is really actually very simple, just not something that we're normally taught, and it's surprising how simple some of it is.
Yes. Yes, it is. And also, what I've found along the lines of what you were speaking about within the sphere of sattva, in my own case and in other cases I'm aware of, there's no real context for understanding, various Vedic terminology and things like that, but things are still unfolding. Yeah.
Yeah,
And so perhaps there isn't the languaging immediately available, or it's a different type of languaging.
yeah,
But whatever the case may be, as these layers of unresolved material are intelligently processed and healed and resolved and attentively allowed, then that level of uh, hmm, that level of clarity, as you were saying,
yeah,
continues to shine forth, and with that, we will see uh, a greater level of mm, uh, yeah I wouldn't say cognitive capacity, but a clearer recognition of what's taking place
Right.
within the intelligence of the self. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the interesting things to note is that consciousness itself is lit. It's
Mhm.
There's a light, and it's down at a very subtle level, but it shines out through the layers onto the surface. And as we clear those shadows, then more and more the light can get through, and there's more clarity. Of course, I'm talking visual terms here.
Yes.
I'm a visual person, and I tend to use visual words. But that's not a barrier. Just there shouldn't be an expectation that you're going to see things necessarily.
Yes.
That's just one mode or one style.
Hmm.
Some people are more somatic, and they're more bodily, the sensations and intuitive kinds of knowing. And some people are more auditory, sound and vibration, and on that level. And in fact, sound is actually a more subtle of the three. Sight is actually the most coarse. However, it has an association with mind, and so people who are visual can sometimes have an easier time with finding words
Hmm.
than
Yes.
other
Yeah, I've
people.
noticed that as
But
well.
yeah, but I mean, of course, there's all kinds of variations. But just keeping in mind that if we describe these different layers, and I use visual words, I'm not referring to that's the only way you're going to experience it.
Yes, that
Can be no.
doesn't mean that if things are unfolding and that's not taking place, that something's wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I know people in very advanced stages who get very little visual stuff.
Yes.
Boy, do they get understanding and knowledge. And,
Hmm.
yeah, just very profound insights.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So it's a process. So the other part is soma, and that's something that with a lot of crazy baggage around it. I've seen academic texts, this thick, that are research into how soma was a magic mushroom, and that some of they describe in the old texts and so on. In the Rig Veda, it's a very ancient book composed of 10 sub-books or mandalas, and one of the mandalas is almost entirely devoted to the topic of soma.
Hmm.
Um, but what's been missed is that soma is actually a subtle, um, we can go even more subtle there. Soma is essentially I'm not sure if divine mind is the right way to put it, but it's essentially this level of divinity that is just essentially like an ocean of milk. It's called in the text. It's just like
Yeah.
pure white light.
Hmm.
And there's this whole story about the devas and the demons all getting together and churning the ocean to produce
Hmm.
soma. But an actual fact, the ocean itself is soma.
Yes.
But it's raw soma. It's not soma in a way that they can use directly. It's too abstracted, I guess you could say. Um,
And when you say they, you're speaking about
the,
laws of nature.
yeah, the
Yeah.
devas, the light beings, uh, the gods, or however you want to frame that. And yeah, we can get into that in a moment. But um, so essentially, the humans have this unique, well, not unique, but we have a capacity to be what the ninth model refers to as the filter. So essentially, when we transcend and go into samadhi in meditation and so on, and that becomes ongoing after we wake up, um, the the ocean that we're essentially immersed in, um, the soma comes down and through the brain and is filtered, and it drips in the back of the throat. And we get a sweet taste sometimes when we're coming in and out or out of samadhi. Tariya
Hmm.
is another word for it. Um, and we taste that and swallow it, goes down into the digestion, and then it's distributed out throughout the body. And that uh, it's basically the nectar of the gods, they describe it. And it essentially feeds the laws of nature and allows them to perform better, to do better. It's kind of like protein drinks, not a good example, but It's like a, you know, um, Powerade for the Davids. I don't know. There's not a good word for it, but comes to mind. But
So on this subject, if someone doesn't have any context for what you're describing and the way that you're going through it, this can still be taking place, yeah, and it's also not solely limited to uh, samadhi. So it could, for those that are already in a certain stage, this could be taking place on a regular basis. Yeah.
right after you wake up. But also there's a thing, when you change states of consciousness on a routine basis, when you go from waking to sleep, for example, or sleeping to dream, each time you change states of consciousness, you actually drop into the transcendent momentarily.
Hmm.
But most people aren't conscious of that simply because it's kind of foggy down there, and meditation can kind of make that more clear. And
Yes.
so there is these brief um, touching in unconsciously, and that also can bring a little soma in as well. And but the clearer we get, the more it's there. And we might not be conscious of this particularly, um, or even secondarily. Just occasionally we get a sweet taste in the back of the mouth, or something, or we notice our nature support is getting better. But by that
Yeah.
I mean that our actions and intentions are they are much easier to complete, and we get results much better, and things, opportunities show up that didn't tend to show up so much before.
Yes.
And so essentially, there's all these. Okay, I guess we do need to touch on this. So there's two modes. I talked about the masculine and feminine before, but
Hmm.
there's also what's known as the personal and impersonal.
Yes.
The path of the mind and intellect is the impersonal, where we see the world as functioning from laws of nature and principles and processes and so on like that. The
Yes.
intellectual approach. The other side is the more feminine side is the personal, the heart-based approach, where those same laws of nature can be perceived as personified.
Hmm.
So, and gravity maybe is a bad example. The wind. The
Hmm.
wind is kind of a function of nature uh, that you know uh, moves things around, and it has various relationships with tides and so on, and the spinning world. Um, but you can also experience the wind as beings that are creating the wind. And an example I sometimes use is, I went on a plane trip one time, and we passed through a very windy area, and it was we got a roller coaster kind of ride where the plane would go like this, and then kind of lift and then move again, and stuff. So I tuned into the wind Davids in the area,
Hmm.
and they basically said, oh, we're just doing our job. And so then I went up the ladder, because a lot of those laws of nature are in hierarchies.
Yes.
And so I went up the ladder in the hierarchy and talked to the manager, so to speak, and says, "Oh yeah, no problem." And he moved them off to another place, and our plane smoothed out. A friend of mine gives the example sometimes. He had a massive flock of birds decide to take up residence in his backyard, and they were crapping on everything basically. And so he did the same kind of thing, and the the birds moved into a nearby forest. So it's
Beautiful.
thought to be a problem.
Now on this point, so when we speak about the personal and the impersonal,
Yeah,
even in the context of there being a more personified recognition within the self, it doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a visual, specific
right,
perception of a given
right.
being. So the way that first showed up here, there was very much that personified relational value of love in reference to trees and various things like this. Mm,
Yeah,
or different aspects of nature and experience, but it was absent of a definite perception, yeah, visual perception of the form of a being.
yeah, and it's kind of one of the ways you might find it is there's a sense of the tree because the tree has life, and they actually have a value of senses as well, not
Yeah.
how we relate to them, and they don't have like, for example, they don't have sight sense organs, so they
Yeah.
can't focus the way we can, but they're still a subtle, because there's consciousness, there's still a subtle sense of sight. um, so if, for example, if you sit at the base of a tree for 10 minutes or so, they can become aware of you.
Hmm.
um, but if you just ride by on your bicycle at 30, they barely notice, because there's not enough of that unless you have a really strong presence. Um, so there's the presence of the tree itself, but you can notice this other separate sense of presence or intelligence or qualities that
Yeah.
are associated with the tree, but they're not the tree itself.
Yes, like
Because
governing intelligence. Yeah.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
and so they'll be there. Like, for example, there'll be a group of flowers, and they'll have a flower deva that's specific to those kind of flowers. There'll be one there somewhere.
Yes.
So there'll be a bunch of flowers with one. Um, and what surprised me was that even man-made objects like cars and couches and things
Hmm.
uh, have laws of nature associated with them, and that they tend to be quite a bit uh, sleepier, and there's more Thomas there, I guess, inertia, because they're to deal with material objects as opposed to life forms. Um, but yeah, it's there in just about everything.
Okay.
And some of the more surface sorts of beings, I found, have a bit of attitude about people, because we're, from their perspective, disrespectful. We don't treat nature in a respectful kind of way, and many traditional approaches and faiths will, for example, if they're going to take a tree, they'll do a ceremony and prayer and thank you to the tree, uh, and rather than just kind of bulldozing the whole thing kind of thing. There's more respect and so on in there, whereas we've kind of lost that perception, and so we've lost that uh,
Yes.
thing. And so there's kind of, some of them have a bit of attitude, and could be can cause a bit of trouble sometimes. um, and then there's much more subtle. Yeah, I was kind of backwards a bit myself. I started seeing visually, um, but because of some experiences I had when I was young, I was quite reticent. I started experiencing visually forms of what we call gods or whatever, quite advanced forms, um, and I was really circumspect. This was it wasn't comfortable for me. I don't know what this stuff is. You know, was this my imagination? What is this weird thing going on? And then over time, I opened up a little bit more, and then some knowledge was able to be communicated. And then, I kind of became more accepting and understood the principles and point. But I had sort of there was more shadow in more surface levels, and so it took me a little more time to clean that out, and then became more conscious in those other levels. So I've been a bit backwards in certain ways, working
And
my
in
way
this,
up.
I'll just remind everyone that we're not talking about uh, any sort of separate otherness in this
Yeah,
sphere. It's all the same self that is experiencing itself thusly. Yeah, like that.
yeah. There's also one factor that's really important in this side of it. Some spiritual traditions recommend you stay away from all that kind of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and that's partly because of what I would call personalization. And that's because when you experience things from the personal, some beings have the ability to present themselves as they wish,
Yes.
because essentially they're functioning on what we would consider dream level of experiences. And
Yes.
so they have dream bodies, we could say, and so they can create whatever body they want. Some are a little more identified, and so their bodies are more fixed and stuff. But and so you see uh, beings presenting themselves as being some divine being, and and but they're not.
Yes.
Um, One of the places where that's trickiest around is channeling, for example,
Hmm.
in the old sense of the word, where the channeler essentially opens themselves up to a subtle being to take over, where they're giving up their body mind integration in order to have a being
Hmm.
work through them. Um, Only astral level, more gross type beings would ever do that.
Yes.
A divine being would never take over someone like that because it's contrary to their spiritual development. Because
Hmm.
mind-body integration is an important part of the progress, and so stepping away from that,
Sure.
I'm not
And
sure
there's
what that's
there's
over.
various.
Uh,
Right.
yeah, but anyway, so it's a you have to be what we people tend to become aware of first is more broadly what we call the astral type beings, and there it's very much like uh, humans, a human level. Many of them are humans between lifetimes, but there's some that are lots that are good or fine, and what people would call guides and things. But there's also some less desirable characters in there, and troublemakers and people who have stepped off their path and don't want to do the work that needs to be done or whatever, and and so they're kind of just bored and wanting to cause trouble.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so it's important that when you when you start to have subtle experiences, not to take any of it too seriously. Um, there's not only their ability to show up, but there's also what we contribute to it.
Mm.
A good example is this idea of the angels having wings. Most of Christian, um, paintings stuff always show angels as having wings, but divine beings are functioning on a level where they're essentially clouds of light with intelligence. They can take a form in order to communicate with us. And if we have an expectation that angels are supposed to have wings, then odds are they'll present themselves that way. Um, but an astral being that has the ability to control their appearance can take that appearance as well. So you can't. It's not about appearances. So one of the things I use for that kind of standard I use for that kind of stuff is how do they feel,
Hmm.
and um, what are they offering? Are they offering secret special knowledge or some kind of control thing going on, or is it whether just offering more neutral yeah. So I don't know. I don't want to get into this. That's a whole bunch of time on this, but
Yeah.
as a note that just to be because people tend to experience the astral stuff first before they're experiencing divine, and because it's really cool and they can be really fancy in that, they may overestimate the importance of what they're experiencing and the importance of the beings involved, and they can fall prey to being manipulated. I did a little of that myself.
Yes, and then I'll make one more point in reference to this topic is that
Yeah,
also there can be a stable shift and perhaps not a lot of refined perception or things are still unfolding, and so there's not a definite sense of relating with subtle forms or anything like that,
yeah,
but there can be subtle influence on some level that could potentially be distracting or
yeah,
mischievous, like you were saying, not directly recognizable as coming from a particular form, but still present on a subtle level. So it's something to be aware
yeah,
of and
yeah,
have discernment in reference to. And I think what you said about the feeling tone of it and everything like that is extremely valuable.
yeah. And that's one of the reasons why it's really important to also to clear up our emotional stuff
Yes.
so we can recognize when because the darker beings, for example, they live on energy, and so they want a certain
Food.
flavors of energy.
Yeah.
And so if they like anger, then
Yeah.
they'll try and culture anger, and they'll kind of poke us in a way that makes us angry. It's like
Yeah.
we bring our unresolved anger, and that. Whereas when we start resolving that stuff, then we're not going to be triggered that way, and then they basically move on.
Yes. Yeah. Beautiful. That's another amazing point is that to the degree that there is healing and resolution is to the degree that we're going to be free from a lot of the uh, potential mishaps that could arise within that sphere, or at least have a greater capacity to discern when some of that activity is present.
Yeah, I mean, I can give one of my own examples. When I first started experiencing some of this stuff, there was a few beings that I met who were more than happy to answer any questions I had. And but what was revealed over time was they actually didn't have any knowledge. They were just kind of, they didn't know. They were just kind of just say something.
Just making stuff up.
Yeah, essentially. And I mean, they had a little bit of background or something,
Sure.
but so they didn't. But it pretty quickly became apparent. But I also caught myself becoming dependent, leaning on them.
Yes.
And when I realized I was starting to make routine decisions based on their feedback,
Uh-huh.
I mean, all this happened pretty quickly, but I realized, okay, this is a mistake. I put this aside, ignore it, don't give it any attention, and it faded out because I didn't have. So then, a little while later, along comes these divine beings, and I thought, oh, this again, which is why I was kind of circumspect about it, and then over time it became clear that they were distinct.
Yeah, beautiful. I'm really glad you shared that about the dependency and that sort of unhealthy dynamic that can
Yeah,
present itself, because I've seen that elsewhere as well. And
yeah, it's codependency essentially, and that's the same with spiritual teachers. I mean, you have to be so careful about getting caught
yeah,
up in yeah, it's yeah, because teachers might be awake, but if they still have some emotional shadows and so on like that, and they haven't dealt with, then they can, and if they're not clear enough, they can act that out with their students. I've had
yeah,
I've had good friends who kind of went sideways and
sure.
went to their head.
Let's talk about that for a sec, if you don't mind, just with
Sure, sure.
in the context of teachers. I was being fairly new into the whole spiritual sphere in the context of this lifetime. Um, the way that I was introduced to the spiritual path had to do with daily inventory work, looking at unresolved areas, facing those things, resolving those things, healing those things. And so I was sort of surprised when I started looking into different uh, conferences like the Science and Non-Duality Conference, or different groups and different things that were going on, that there was a lot of seemingly or apparently advanced levels or recognitions or cases of awakening where that was totally absent, and there had been no real investigation into unresolved past material, no real healing, no real level of accountability, transparency, those kinds of things.
Yeah,
Mm. So it seems that what a true teacher represents is not only the status of an actual grounded shift and a recognition of one's reality, but also that level of transparency and accountability and clarity, like you were speaking about before in reference to sattva and the healing of all of that unresolved material.
yes, and yeah, honesty, self-honesty, and honesty with students. When they're going through stuff, that they're open about it. It's um, it's tricky. I mean, everybody has their blind spots.
Mm.
Every teacher I've known has their blind spots, and that's just the nature of being human, really. By the time we clean it all up, we're done. So it's tricky stuff. But if we're open, like one of the things that sprung out of some of the people who are regulars at SAND is the Association for Spiritual Integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Basically to try and set ethical guidelines, because most spiritual teachers in the West are independent. Um, they may be associated with a tradition or may not be, but they tend to be quite independent. And there's a lack of peer support. And so you can end up with a scenario where you're above the students, and so you don't have anybody calling you on your stuff,
Mm.
and anybody giving you feedback on your shadows and things. And I've found that very valuable. I mean, I have a few friends who are more than happy to point out when I'm being stupid about something.
Yes,
or
exactly.
going to a certain place where I tend to go sometimes. And so it's good. It's like, oh, right, I'm doing it again. And, those old things. And it's very, very healthy, because otherwise you can get caught up in your stuff. And there can be very valid experiences of feeling very complete, and that you're connected with all knowledge, and whatever you need to know will know. And like we talked earlier about, when you speak, it speaks through you, and all
Yes.
that. And you can let that go to your head. I mean, there is a cosmic value of the ego as well, which was part of the process, is letting that one go too. But some teachers get really caught in that, and sure, I mean, that there's teachers who say that there's some form of God or whatever like that, but I've experienced that myself, but I don't go around saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm this God." Because it's like, if you actually understand God, that the divine is so much more than just a specific form of God. And
Exactly.
just, I mean, the chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita is a classic example where the Prince Arjuna asked Krishna to show him his true form.
Hmm.
Krishna is there in a human form, um, but asked him to show his true form, and Krishna says, "Oh, I don't know, it's not." But he said, "No, no, I want to see." And so he shows him, and basically Arjuna is completely overwhelmed, because he's basically everything everywhere all at once. And and there's a
Yeah,
zillion forms and appearances, both divine and destructive. And
of course.
yeah,
And even as you were saying, even these types of recognitions are to be surrendered, yeah,
yeah,
or to be let go of. So I
exactly.
have the similar,
At
similar
every stage of the way, everything you gain has to be surrendered. And
yes,
for each stage, the previous stage has to be
has to
surrendered.
be surrendered. And in the context of what you were saying about peer support, that the level of accountability um, is so important to have to have those that are committed to truth around you, not committed to your image, and so that they know, and there's an agreement that truth comes first. That all this
Yeah,
other, whatever's unfolding on the level of a teaching, and I'm speaking more in the case here, but whatever's unfolding on the level of a teaching is secondary to truth. And when that is in place, it's an expression of grace. Yeah.
yes, I quite agree. It's so, and that's one of the dangers. Well, because sometimes there can be this sense of there being no person here, and there's certainly
Mm.
renunciate teachings that support that. But when you become convinced, that's not the right word there, but when you buy into that narrative and you sustain it in spite of everything, the hazard of that notion is that you can get into caught in ideas that you're now perfect, and because there's no person here, it's only just the
Yeah,
perfect
and that means that
yeah,
what everyone else is all of the activity within the field of experiencing is basically just nonsense, because they all think that they're people. And
yeah,
so it could be a very tricky situation. And I think
yeah.
uh, I've witnessed that in certain cases for sure. Mm.
Whereas I've maintained, you need a person to function in the world. I've made, to me, because I did have a sense of ego death when I first woke up. So not everybody does experience it that way, but here it was. Um, but after a short time, I realized what had actually died was not the ego itself, but the identification with the ego. And now
Mm.
here by ego, I mean the ahamkara, the I sense. Um, and there is a need to function and recognize that this is the body mind, and not this table over here. um, they're it's a distinct object, and if you confuse the two, then it's really hard to function in the world.
Yeah.
um, and so
But
by
that is spontaneous. That level of you know you know discrimination or whatever is taking place within the sphere of activity. It doesn't have to be a conscious decisioning
right,
from someone. It's a pure
yeah,
flow of intelligence.
right, and there is also the sense, that there is a stage in unity where you look at table and you recognize you are that as well, but
Yes.
you are that on a level of consciousness. um, not on the surface level. The surface level, it's like a
You
tree.
don't go and, put your hand into the
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. So on the surface level, it's like all the leaves on the tree, but
Mm.
we're all the same trunk. It's kind of like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
beautiful. And let's go a little deeper into this because I think it's so important within the sphere of personhood, in the sense of personhood. In uh, As things are unfolding in these stages, mm, the sense of there being a separate individual as a substantial entity does disappear. It's no longer there as,
yeah,
in the sense of there being a separate individual person.
yeah,
But the personal value, the persona, that which is operative in the world, is still present. So as you were saying, I was graced with, through the entire unfoldment, I was working, at a restaurant, working at a gym in membership sales, working, had these regular jobs the whole way through, working at a warehouse and in Pure Divinity, and when Pure Divinity was, in a stage of integration and unification and everything, like, which it still is, of course, for as long as there's a body.
I think so. Yeah,
But it's such a beautiful, it's something that is extremely valuable in the context of surfacing and, you know mm, that which is unresolved being reflected back, and the capacity to allow that light of love to really shine into the experience in a much fuller and richer way.
yes, yes, and just recognizing it's there. I mean, because I'm very aware of there are some gifts that have come with this process,
Hmm.
and some of them still surprise me. I mean, we talked about talking through earlier, for
Yes.
example, but I'm also aware of like the blind spots and the stuff that I'm aware of is still here. I mean, if it was I totally saw my blind spot, it wouldn't be a blind spot anymore. but but I,
That's
but I,
right.
but I know that there's things that are here playing out, you know, and there's so many layers to it too. Is because it's as you go deeper into the process, it becomes more and more collective.
Mm.
And so there's this process right now, for example, where I'm finishing this PhD process, and it's kind of been this kind of like meme in my life since I can remember. Um, and it became really clear recently that there's this ancestral stuff that I wasn't conscious of before that was pushing behind that. And then more recently, again, I've become conscious that there's this stuff from the spiritual tradition that I've been in for several lifetimes that's also pushing in that. And it's quite wild because it's not just my own stuff that I'm working out, but I'm kind of working. I've become this vehicle for working out this set of things collectively. There are a bunch of different threads, and I'm sure it's not all even clear, but there's
Yeah.
just this force behind it. It's just like it's just surprising.
Uh-huh.
It's just kind of like organizing everything, and it's all happening really fast. And this is after spending some years trying to figure out how to pull it off, and it all just goes over quick, when the time comes. Um, but there's a whole series of dynamics in behind this stuff, and it was a lot of it was unresolved business and not just personal, but it was kind of like this kind of collective unresolved thing that's
Mm.
somehow resolving through this. And of course, I don't see it a big enough perspective to see all the details of that, but it's quite clear that it's some major thing being worked out, and it's there's a lot of in religious and spiritual traditions, even actually a lot of things in justice and education and stuff. There's a lot of symbolic kinds of things that are done, and there's a lot of power behind that in terms of completion and resolving that I didn't recognize before. I've certainly
Yeah.
seen that in some of the Vedic performances and like the Guru Puja that's used in teaching meditation. And I've seen the power in those, but I'm seeing it at a whole other level with this process that of how it's kind of like But I guess if you think about it, there's on the level of kind of a causal going into the intellect level, down at a subtle level, there's these memes or idea forms that are there that are kind of like the perfect form. And you know, if you can kind of embody that through, then it can kind of, some of that, more of that can express through your life. I don't know if that's what's going on here, but it's but yeah, there's a very, on a subtle level, there's kind of the idea forms, and maybe that's what it's playing to.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah, so life is such an adventure.
It is, yeah, and that's how it becomes when we're free of that sense of limitation and struggle and
Yeah,
feeling so constricted, you know.
yeah. There's a word they also call in Sanskrit is asmita, which is
Mm,
kind of like the my sense. There's the I sense. There's also this my sense where, you know, you look at young children and they first start to differentiate themselves from their mother, and then because they don't really see a difference at first, and then by the time they get to be about 2 years old, they start to get a my sense, and it's not just um, I, but there's my body, my toy, my books. And you kind of get this terrible two kind of things as the emotional body starts becoming more online. And yeah, so that's kind of when it kicks in, and that's one of the things that does fade off with awakening.
yes, and that also we can kind of tie that into the layers of divinity that we started out with, and we really, you know, explored a lot, which is so beautiful. Um, and seeing, you know, that all of this perceptual creation, all of this presentation is uh, is the image of divinity, yeah,
Yes,
and recognizing the divine nature of all it is allows this. In a certain sense, you could have the perspective that it belongs to divinity, even though it doesn't in that way. Yeah. So there's a deep level of appreciation that can be present
yes,
within the sphere of activity. Yeah. Mm.
yes, and that there is this the importance of being conscious, because when it's not conscious, when divinity is not conscious for us, then it's I mean, it can be seen in certain ways. Like a lot of famous scientists, like Einstein and Newton and Galileo and stuff, believed in an impersonal God. They just saw this fundamental order in the world. Like if you look at just basic physical laws, like the second law of thermodynamics, essentially says that if you leave a system to itself, it breaks down into dust. It just inherently falls apart, and inertia takes over, and entropy, and it dissolves. Um, so in order for something to be maintained, there has to be a constant input of order, and for that system not just to be maintained but to grow and evolve, even more order.
Mm.
So there's this powerful intelligence behind everything. Uh, and if you look closely, it's so obvious. I mean, there's certainly, you know, seeing the golden spiral and so on, and all through nature, and these really artful, you know, some of those simple formulas that describe these beautiful patterns in nature, very simple ratios and things.
And
Excuse me.
then even the flower,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
also more
We talk
simplistic.
about,
Yeah.
perhaps it'd be useful to just go over it, you know, in briefly,
Sure.
the layers of divinity. So we have, you know, the outermost layer, you could say, is what we would call the physical, where inertia is greatest, where there's mass and solidity, apparent solidity of the world. Um, Next stage, less subtle, or more subtle rather, is uh, the energy level, what we would experience objectively as the emotional, our emotions, and the more surface emotions. And it's the level of what's known as prana or chi. Although prana has to move through several layers, but that's why we first deal with it. And so we have our physical body, we have our nervous system and our circulatory system with the blood and our lymph system. The energy body has what's known as nadis, so energy channels, where the prana flows around, and the soma I was mentioning earlier ties into that too. And then the next more subtle level is what we would call we would experience as the mind or mental body. That's essentially a level of fields where the qualities are being structured. And then we have the next more subtle is known as the intellect, the intuition. It's the level of sacred geometry where the subtle structuring takes place. And then we have the causal or celestial level where we have the world's first becoming, the fine vibrations that give rise to the world. So you have these fine vibrations, and then there are these subtle devata. They're essentially light beings that essentially just points of light. They don't take forms, and they work in teams. And they have this kind of they create a space in consciousness. Consciousness is nested, and space is nested, and time is nested, layers within layers. That's a whole other topic. But essentially, they work in these teams in a kind of a sphere facing each other, and they interact, and they create these fine sutras, light, and then they modulate them with sound and vibrate the vibration, and that gives structure and basic structure and qualities to form. And then the mind level adds the fields, and then it's energized on the emotional body level, and then expressed into form on the physical level. It depends. Some things only come up as far as the mind, and we experience them as thoughts or dreams, ideas, and some things come up further up, and we experience those as emotions and so on.
Yeah.
And then a step more subtle than the causal level, where the vibration is a subtle space in consciousness, in universal consciousness, that it's not really a manifest space yet. It's kind of like a more subtle than that. And it's simply this dynamic of awareness, aware of itself, and then it flows within itself. So there's flows of consciousness basically on that level. That's the field of what I would call creation.
Yeah.
And within that are these subspaces that hold our universe. One of them is our universe. And there's other universes with somewhat different laws of nature. And within that space of our universe is that fine vibration begins, and the whole process I just talked about.
Yes.
And then prior to that is the level of consciousness itself, pure consciousness, or Atman, the self. So it's just consciousness alone on that level. And then a step before that is what's known as Brahman, or beyond consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And we could go into a whole talk on each of these. I do talk more about this on my blog, various articles, if you're interested. And then there's finer values of Brahman, in which you can become aware that there's these kind of unmanifest qualities of alertness and liveliness and intelligence, and those are what give rise to consciousness. When liveliness stirs alertness, it becomes conscious, and then stirs it some more, and it starts to flow, and then it curves back on itself and becomes self-aware.
Yes.
And then there's intelligence in there guiding that process, and then allowing consciousness to recognize itself, which is what causes everything else to happen from that. And then the step before that is pure divinity. And yeah, it's hard to talk about pure divinity in any sensible words.
Okay, let's just kind of go over what you just what you just covered, which is a lot. So I feel that it's important for everyone to know that it may be that you do not cognize all of the details that you just described. Yeah, because that is
Right.
relatively rare in the cases that I've seen. And also, I've shared some of my cognitions with you in emails and different things like that. And there's the possibility for different perspectives of the same
Yeah.
basic process. Yeah, and
Well,
so
and
we're
actually, that's
all,
our function, in a
yes,
sense, is
yeah,
we're each separate perspectives of the same whole, because the
yeah.
whole knows itself in its totality, but to know itself in all the details, it needs separate perspectives and separate ways of seeing and so on, slightly different combinations of laws of nature that show up as this person here in order to experience a certain way.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yes.
And pure divinity, as you were saying, is hard to talk about, but at the same time, you can't help but talk about it. The talking comes. So,
And those qualities of alertness and liveliness and that I mentioned, they turn out not to be qualities of Brahman, but of pure divinity.
okay.
These fundamental qualities that give our.
That's an important note too, that what seems to be the case in what you refer to as Brahman, what I refer to as supreme nothingness, the void, sometimes just
Yes.
depends on what seems to be the case there is recognized not to actually have been the case when a more fundamental, when pure divinity
Yes.
is realized. And this can be, and this is the situation through all the shifts actually, in a certain sense, because
Yeah, and that's actually a really important point. Someone in self-realization or in unity consciousness, the earlier stages of enlightenment, will experience consciousness as infinite and eternal and boundless.
yes.
The idea that there's something beyond consciousness is ridiculous.
Oh yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it made into a joke before. Yeah, so it's
Yeah, yeah. And yet, when you start to get to know consciousness on a global level, there can then be sort of like when you wake up to consciousness itself, you start to wonder, well, what's doing the doing? Well, when you get to know consciousness globally, there can be that subtle thing. Okay, where does this come from? And even in there's some subtle dualities, like existence inherently brings with it non-existence, and consciousness brings with it unconscious, and sort of there's still even there's subtle dualities. And so when the interesting part is that consciousness has been looking in on itself all this time, and when it knows itself fully, it can turn and look behind. And because we're talking about the subject and object dynamic, it's like this is happening locally, but it's also happening on a global level. And when
yeah.
it looks beyond itself, so to speak, and
So
yeah,
essentially, one recognizes the substrate of even the self, the
yeah,
field of conscious awareness itself, that which is
yeah,
the source of the light of the field of conscious awareness, and then in the context of the way that you and in that traditional context, you guys put it forth, you recognize the source of the source. I
yeah,
don't contextualize it like that. I look at it a little bit differently, but
yeah,
we're saying the same thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's lots of little variations in this.
Yeah.
And actually, what I found really interesting is once you get into Brahman, the people that I know that have had that shift and further um, become more and more unique. It's
Ah,
like their laws of nature are freed from the constraints even of consciousness, and and they start to become a law unto themselves in a certain kind of a way. It's really quite interesting, that they develop new approaches to their whole life, and the kind of knowledge that comes out, and their approach. I mean, the vast one thing to be clear here, though, just someone who is awake isn't necessarily a teacher. Teaching is a kind of a skill and a dharma. It's not something that you inherently become. The
yeah.
vast majority of people I know who are awake, or even in very advanced stages, are
Hmm.
not teachers. They're just quietly going about their lives in whatever way it is called, and they're just quietly supporting people here and there, and the way they're called to support them. And some people don't have words for all this. They just
Yes,
live it.
that is also the case. And I've,
Yeah, they just live it, and they're happy that I can give it some words so that they can use them once in a while when they need to, and otherwise they don't need them, and they just live it, and it's fine.
yeah,
So
what you were saying about the unique, that unique quality shining forth in those higher stages, I often refer to this childlike maturity in a certain sense. Yeah. So there's
yeah,
this a freedom, a flexibility, and this greater wholeness, this greater allness is expressing freely through this point of experiencing in that way. Mm.
Yeah, and it's a progressive surrender of more and more. It's like we gain more and more, and then we surrender that, and then we surrender
Yeah.
that, and then we surrender that.
Beautiful point that you made right there and earlier about each recognition of reality is given up for that which is beyond it. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
you've
even
spoken before about that in unity, where there's, or what I refer to as dynamic subjectivity. There's a tendency to become very enamored with the everythingness of
oh yeah,
what you recognize yourself to be, and so approaching that nothingness in a supreme way can be a little there's a hesitancy in reference to that.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I know several people who came to the doorway and then took a step back, and it's like whoa, because the idea is that they've gotten this exalted, unification with it. There's such an intimacy with the world and everyone around them, and beautiful, and to give that up for nothing, it's whoa.
Yeah, but it's well
It's
worth it. Yeah.
yes, yes. It's a yeah.
It's well worth it.
Yeah, they call it the Great Awakening, and well, Brahman itself actually means the great, and it's in the old text they call it the Great Awakening because it's essentially the awakening from enlightenment
Mm,
into this new value. And at first it can be it's like you can become conscious of what you've lost more than what you've gained because it's a much subtler much subtler than consciousness, and
yeah,
so orders of magnitude more subtle. And so there can be this little time of settling in, and then discovering what actually is there, and then discovering that there's these qualityless qualities. I mean, it's really even hard to, that like I mentioned before about alertness and liveliness, and that when they're not manifest qualities, they're not really qualities, and yet there,
pre pre
yeah,
quality.
like Brahman can't be known by consciousness
Yeah.
because it's before it consciousness. So Brahman knows itself. You discover Brahman by becoming it.
Hmm.
And yet, because there's that quality of alertness in there, it can be alert to itself.
Sure.
And then when you discover the alertness as a quality of divinity, then you realize that it's divinity that allowed Brahman to know itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then divinity can know divinity.
There's one other point that I'll make while we're on this subject. Certain incarnations I've recognized actually have a specific level of development, sort of karmically uh, operative. So you can see, whole incarnations that have to do with a given shift, and I don't want to say the perfection of that level or the perfection of that shift, but let's say that there's incarnations that are focused more on masculine development, and there's also incarnations that are focused more on feminine development. And there are
Yeah.
many cases
And
in
that
this.
might not be the gender, the same, the matching gender either.
No, it doesn't have anything to do with the body.
Yeah.
Well, it has a lot to do with the body, but not the sex of the body. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yes, it doesn't. Yeah, I'm speaking in terms of masculine, feminine aspects of subjectivity. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so it's a much broader context than it seems to be. And then you have those cases where it's the balancing of those and the unification. And there's also a significant portion, I would say, in the collective now where shifts have already occurred in different incarnations. So it's a revisitation, and things have, there's already been some level of development. And so now we're seeing a different wave, where different aspects are being cultivated and cultured and so on and so forth.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm certainly aware of people who had some of the process beforehand and then came into this life to finish the job. Like they didn't finish cleaning things up or whatever, or they didn't finish a certain kind of development. Um, I personally haven't met anybody who was in an advanced stage in a prior life and then picked up where they left off in this one. I do know a couple of people who, they started witnessing when they were 4, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and really, they just kind of kicked the ball off really early.
No, it's not that you would pick up where you left off. You would still, the process would still unfolds in the same way, but it's a little accelerated. You might say it's not
Yeah,
as yeah.
yeah. There's kind of like there's a thing my teacher would call the need of the time. And so that can be a person who is picked to be uh, whatever, handle whatever situation, kind of like what I talked about with the PhD earlier, only on a larger scale of some kind. And so they're the person who's called to come forward um, and bring out a certain teaching or popularize something, um, something like that. And
Sure.
then they have this exemplary level of support and accomplish remarkable things.
Mm.
Um, those are the exceptions. But yes, there does seem to be some people who I don't I don't I don't know for sure, but it does seem to be that some people are here to be uh, liberated um, in this lifetime, but there doesn't seem to be that they're going to move into further stages. Um, they don't have the scenario. They're basically working through their karma and that, and so they're going to do their further development after this life um, on several levels. And then there's people who seem to go just like you open a tap and they just fly through the stages, um, and almost too fast. Because I mean, one of the things about going through the process is you want to be able to experience each stage, especially if you're going to support anybody else in a teaching role or like I'm a writer, um, and if you can't really talk about it if you're only in the stage for an hour or 2 days or something, because it just went
Yeah.
by and there's very little memory impression of that. Just stepped on by. I've met a couple of people like that where I one person insisted they never had self-realization. They stepped straight into unity. But then when I talked about it with them carefully, they were in self-realization for about an hour and during the process.
Or, yeah,
They
yeah,
just kind of kept moving and they didn't stop. So they didn't even recognize it. That stage is, thought they could skip it. On the other hand, I've also met someone who was convinced that they went straight into unity, and it turned out to be what's called a deflected rising in Kundalini. The Kundalini went up a side channel and gave them
ah,
lots of experiences and some gifts and things, but it wasn't actually a valid awakening and it wasn't stable.
yeah.
And they caused a lot of problems for others. So,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of variation,
yeah,
and it's important to recognize that it's going to be different for everyone.
yeah,
And
yeah. And most people won't have those kind of issues, but
yeah, well, yeah, nothing to be too worried about there, I suppose. But
yeah, for
it
most people, it's just like the chop wood, carry water thing. It's
simple.
just, yeah, it
Yeah,
just, what changes is nothing changes, and yet everything changes. Kind of the world, the life itself kind of continues much the same, but how you're experiencing it changes, where you're experiencing it from, and the context you put it in uh, can change
exactly. Yeah,
distinctly.
yeah. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I feel like we've certainly covered a lot of territory.
Yes, I went a few places I didn't expect to go.
That's how it is, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And I know we could continue to talk for hours, but we'll stop there for today, and
Okay.
uh, I'll look forward to our next chat. Where we'll be able to cover some more of what was left uncovered. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to see
Thank you, David. Good to see you too.
you.